Mayor Allen, once we have quorum of council, you may start the meeting.
Thank you. Okay, can I have a mover and seconder to call the meeting to order, please? Councillor Moore and Councillor Cabral at the special meeting of the Council of the Township of Springwater of November 3rd, 2021 come to order at 4:30 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Due to COVID-19, Council's taken the necessary steps to limit in-person meetings. As such, members of Council are participating in this meeting electronically as our staff. The meeting is being live streamed. You can watch the meeting live on the Township website, www.springwater.ca. You can listen to it by telephone during the meeting by calling 647-558-0588 and using the identification 837-8735-2005#. This option is available during the meeting. For those unable to watch the live stream or listen by phone and want to watch it later on, you can watch the video on the Township's YouTube channel. Council, are there any disclosure of pecuniary interest with respect to this meeting? Seeing none, can I have a mover and seconder to call a public meeting to order, please? Councillor Cabral, Councillor Maude Chapman. That this public meeting of council held under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended for the proposed development charges bylaw and underlying background study be called to order at 4:31 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Welcome to this public meeting of Springwater Township Council held in compliance with Section 12 of the Development Charges Act to give the public an opportunity to express their views in regard to the DC bylaw and background study. The first part of this meeting is to present the background study. Following, the public will be given the opportunity to make an oral submission through the Zoom application. Any person wishing to make an oral submission must have notified the township prior to 12 p.m. this morning and must have been added to the commenters list. All comments or questions should be addressed through myself as chair. Oral submissions will be included in this meeting's minutes and form part of the public record, including the name and address of the speaker as information collected under the Municipal Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. The minutes of the meeting will be posted on the township's website. I will now, in dealing with the DC bylaw and background study, I will now call upon the clerk to confirm notice of this meeting and the dates on which notice was given.
Notice of this public meeting was placed in the Springwater News on the 14th day of October 2021, being a newspaper with general circulation in the township. The notice was also placed on the township's website.
And has the clerk's department received any correspondence in response to the notice of the public meeting?
No correspondence has been received.
Thank you. I will now call on Daryl Abbs, Gary Scandlin, and Sarah Lurenko of Watson & Associates to make their presentation, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a pleasure to be before you and council this evening. I'll be making the presentation and my colleague Daryl will be running the presentation for us. And if Daryl can get control, we'll go through the presentation. Very good. Next slide, please. So this public meeting, very similar to other public meetings held by council. The mayor provided opening remarks. We'll do a brief presentation on the proposed changes to the development charges bylaw. And then there can be questions of the public and council, as the mayor's noted, and then we'll conclude the public meeting. No decisions will be made by council this evening. It's subject to reconsideration in December. Next slide. So very briefly, we've released a background study It's dated October the 15th, 2021. And the purpose of that study is to summarize some of the changes that are proposed. Number one, there have been, and I'll touch briefly on it, there's been changes that have been introduced by the province with respect to the Development Charges Act. So there was 4 different bills that were introduced between June 2019 and the end of 2020, and those have affected your bylaw. So one of the things is to remove there was a mandatory 10% deduction that was made to all of the softer services, your parks, recreation, library, some of the studies. So we've gone back in to make adjustments to those calculations. There has been an update on the costing for the Midhurst Fire Station, so we've made an adjustment for that. Some refinements as recommended in the long-range financial plan. And then, as I've noted, there's some wording changes, cash flow, things that need to be incorporated into the bylaw. And those were introduced through the legislative bills I spoke of. We have released the report, as I noted, in mid-October. And under the Development Charges Act, there's a minimum 60-day circulation period. So we've released the report, and council cannot consider the bylaw until 60 days have passed. In between that 60-day period, we must hold a public meeting, which is what we're doing this evening. Next slide. And this just summarizes the process that we've gone through. You can see step 1 was meeting with staff to go through the updates of the calculation. Step 2 was to release the report, as I've noted, October 15th. Step 3 is our public meeting this evening. And then step 4, that minimum 60 days, you can see we've passed the 2-month period so that council can consider the amending bylaw at that time. Next slide. Development charges, just for the public and to remind anybody who's interested, development charges help municipalities recover the cost of infrastructure which is put into place in order to accommodate both residential and non-residential growth. The Act kind of separates infrastructure costs into 2 categories. One which is very localized, so within a subdivision or within the area to which the plan relates, those very localized costs are basically borne 100% by the developing landowners. The Development Charges Act takes into account those broader services, building of arenas, building of libraries, development of parks, etc. And that's what we include in the development charge. So these have been the rules that we've been working with. Development charges were introduced basically about 65 years ago, but we've had a Development Charges Act since 1989, and that's what has been guiding us since that time in the preparation of these calculations. Next slide. As I've noted, since June 2019, there's been 4 pieces of legislation which have impacted the calculations that we're doing. Bill 108 is the one that it was a very large piece of legislation because it modified 16 other pieces of legislation. Within that were some suggested refinements to the development charge. But really it was Bill 197 that made the significant changes. And I'll just go through briefly on those changes. Next slide. So as I've noted, there are, within the calculations we did historically, there was a mandatory 10% deduction. So we'd make all of these calculations and make deductions for grants and subsidies and other things. And we get down to the bottom and the legislation said deduct an extra 10%, and the municipality had to contribute towards that. With the changes that have been introduced by Bill 197, we don't need that 10% mandatory deduction. So we've gone back in to basically remove it, which has provided for a slightly higher recovery for those services. And it allows, at least for those services, for us to be moving towards a closer full cost recovery. There are some adjustments to how we lay out or organize some of the services. I won't get into a lot of detail, but we've gone from calling growth studies a service to calling it a class of service, because those growth studies actually are kind of an amalgam of water, wastewater, a number of different services. So the growth studies have been called a class under the new legislation. And then, as I noted earlier, that the fire station services has been adjusted to reflect a higher cost associated with the Midhurst station. Next slide. With the legislation, what they've done is they've allowed development, certain types of development, a little bit more time to make the payments. So for rental housing, or for nonprofit, or for institutional developments, the payments can be made in installments over a number of years. Rental and institution, they pay in 6 installments over 5 years, first on occupancy, then the next 6 years, next 5 years on the anniversary. And for nonprofit housing, you pay over 21 years. They've also introduced a rate freeze so that if I come forward with an application for site plan or for a zoning amendment, the charge is in effect at the time I come forward with that and you accept my application. The rates are frozen until 2 years after you approve my application, if you do approve it. And if I commence building within that 2-year period, the frozen rates are what I pay. And if I exceed that 2-year period, then it goes back to whatever the rates in effect at the time are what we pay. Now, there is an opportunity to charge interest to either those installment payments or to the rate freeze. So basically it allows for some level of interest adjustment every year to reflect the fact that you're not receiving the money up front. There's a mandatory exemption for ancillary units. So for the most part, newer additional units, secondary units are basically exempted from the charge. And then universities have also been exempted. Associated with the above, we've made some refinements to definitions. So next slide. With respect to the charge, you can see that this is what was contained in your bylaw currently. We are making the adjustments to the bylaw in 2018 dollars because that's when you passed it. So if you look at the calculations we've done, we've basically deflated it back to 2018. You can see we've got, for residential, we've got 5 different categories, from the large units down to very, very small apartment units. And we've got non-residential charges basically expressed on the cost per square foot or the cost per square meter of floor area. The yellow areas are where we've made the adjustments to the charge. You can see fire, indoor and outdoor rec, libraries, and then some adjustments to growth studies are where we've made those adjustments. And on the next slide, you can see what's in the current bylaw and then the adjustments that we're recommending. So fire protection has moved from about $1,640 up to $2,200. Parks and Rec is increased by roughly about $570. Libraries, roughly about $90, and then growth studies, just a marginal $12. All in all, you total it up, and we've increased we're recommending increasing the charges by a little over $1,200 a unit. This is for a single detached. Next slide. On the non-residential side, you can see that this is expressed on a cost per square foot, that we're going from $3.40 for those services, the township-wide services, to $3.75. So basically a 35-cent increase overall on the calculation of the charge. Next slide. Really, that's in summary, that's the adjustments that are contained within that update study that we've provided. At this particular point, we've noted that, or just to remind that we'll consider the amending bylaw. We'll be back with council to consider and potentially approve the changes at the December 15th meeting. That's my remarks, Mr. Oh, sorry. Apologize for that. A couple of more slides just to put the charges within Springwater in perspective relative to other areas throughout Simcoe County. So you can see the highest charges right now are basically within the Springwater Elmville area. And there, the dark blue is the county of Simcoe. The gray represents the local municipalities such as yourselves. And then there's also the dark gray, which is the education charges. So we've provided the total of the three for comparative purposes. So you can see your charges are in and around ESSA's charges. A little bit, ESSA is a little bit higher at the front end and a little bit lower elsewhere. And you see the highest charges right now are basically in Bradford or Innisfil, ranging in about $75,000 to $90,000 for a single detached unit. Next slide. You can see on the commercial side, similar type of comparison. You can see you're at the middle or at the very low end of the comparative municipalities. Next slide. And this is on for industrial and a similar type of comparison as the prior slide. So these are how your charges relate to many other municipalities throughout the Simcoe County area. Next slide. So that this time, this concludes my remarks, Mr. Mayor. And as I say, I'm happy to answer any questions council may have or the public.
Thank you, Mr. Scanlon. I'll now call upon the clerk to provide the number of people who have registered to ask questions or make comments regarding this application.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. There are no commenters registered to make an oral submission on this application.
Thank you. I'd ask that the presentation be taken down and turn now to council for any questions or comments regarding this matter. Councillor Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Through you to Mr. Scanlon. I'm just curious, really. The Elmville DCs are higher than those in Midhurst, and I'm just curious what the rationale would be. Is it because Elmville is already built up and some of the infrastructure is already in place, or because Midhurst hasn't really started to put that infrastructure in place?
Mr. Scanlon.
Sorry, hit the wrong button. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the councillor. Really where the changes are we have the township-wide charges, which are roads, fire, and the parks, recreation, library. Those are common across all of the areas. Where we see the difference is really in the water and the wastewater services. In Midhurst, most of those costs are being picked up directly by the developing landowners, where we've got a slightly different basis for calculation in the Elmhurst area.
Thank you.
How frequently are DC charges reviewed and revised, Mr. Scanlon? The maximum life of your bylaw is 5 years. But you can come in at any time and amend it, or if you want to revisit the bylaw earlier than 5 years, you can do it at any time. Okay. And the last time we did it was when?
2018.
2018. Okay. Other questions, comments, council? Councillor Hannah?
Thank you, Mayor. Sir, if you could, through you, Mayor, to you, sir, if you could just help my memory with the difference between hard surface and soft services, and also the agreements that we used to be able to get that were front-ended when developers wanted to front-end and so on. I understand all that's changed, and I just would appreciate an update on that, please.
Mr. Scanlon?
Absolutely, through the mayor. So the softer services in the town-wide charges right now include your soft services such as parks and recreation, libraries, and some of the growth studies. We also include in the town-wide services related to a highway, which are roads and public works, and then fire protection. So the softer services are, for the most part, are your parks, recreation, library types of services.
Thank you, sir. And my follow-up through the mayor to you was the difference between what exists now and what used to be when we could get upfront agreements where developers would upfront money for, say, recreation or infrastructure.
Sorry, I missed that question. Absolutely. You still, through the mayor, you still have the opportunity to do front ending. You still have the opportunity to ask developing landowners if they would wish to assist in any project by prepaying their development charges. So those opportunities are still available to you. What's changed is you can require earlier payments for water, wastewater, and roads, but you cannot mandate it earlier payments for the other services. It's something you would have to negotiate. But it's still available. It's just you cannot mandate it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other questions or comments of council, thank you to all who participated in the public meeting with respect to this matter and for showing interest in this matter. Can I have a mover and seconder to adjourn this public meeting? Councillor Cabral, Councillor Ma Chapman, that the public meeting held under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act 1997 as amended does now adjourn at 4:52 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you, Mr. Scanlon and team. Now we move on to the confirmatory bylaw. Mover and seconder, please. Councillor Ritchie, Councillor Moore, that bylaw 2021-102 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council at the regular meeting held on November 3rd, 2021 listed herein be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All those in favor? And a mover and seconder for adjournment, please. Councillor Moore, Councillor Cabral, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater is now adjourned at 4:53 p.m. to meet again in regular meeting November 3rd, 2021 at 6:30 p.m. All those in favor? That is carried. Thank you.
Do we use the same link or is there another one?
There's another link.
Thank you.